Well, it's a great pleasure this morning to introduce Professor David Cook. He is Holmes Professor of Faith and Learning at Wheaton College in the States. He is Fellow of Green College, Oxford, and also Professor of Christian Ethics at the Southern Seminary in Louisville. He was elected a Fellow of Green College, where he served as chaplain and was the founding director of the Whitfield Institute. His teaching ranged from medical ethics to philosophy of religion and Christian ethics. He's written quite a number of books, and in particular we've got this one, The Moral Maze. He's also done quite a lot of broadcasting, and there was this, I think, riveting Radio 4 program called The Moral Maze, to which David contributed many times. He's also spoken on Thought for the Day, of course, for the cause, and done the daily service. He's had his own radio and television series too. And he's a former member of the British Medical Association Medical Ethics Committee and the Archbishop's Medical Ethics Advisory Committee. And he remains a member of the United Kingdom Xenotransplantation Interim Regulatory Authority.
You can see it, you get a degree.
Yeah, quite. And he's given advice to select committees of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. He's currently completing a book on contraception and working through a successor to this book, working on a successor called Through the Moral Maze, which looks at fertility, genetics, sexuality, environment, and war and peace. And he's also working on books on the ethics of palliative care and one on the beginning of life. He's also edited with Dot Chappell a book called Not Just Science, which draws from a wide range of the sciences and examines how Christianity influences and affects scientific work. He's interested in neuroethics, genetic engineering, xenotransplantation, as I've said, and robotics, as well as medical ethical issues. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, David. Thank you.
I always think when you have such a generous introduction that if my father were alive, he would be really proud to hear that. If my mother were alive, she would believe it all. Recognising that at 9 o'clock in the morning we're not always at our best, I have an outline for the lecture which hopefully you all received, so you can snooze while I talk. I want to begin by talking about the Moral Maze programme. For 5.5 years, I, along with Michael Burke and Janet Daly, David Starkey, and then a revolving left-wing journalist, it wasn't always the same one each week, used to take part in this Radio 4 weekly discussion programme that still goes on. You have to understand that the moral maze was always a current moral problem from the news and in the news. On a Monday morning we would have a phone call from the researcher, and she would say, well, what shall we do this week? And we'd be looking for a story which in their jargon had legs. That meant it had to survive till Wednesday, when we actually made the programme live, but more importantly, it had to survive till Saturday, when the repeat went out. Because what you didn't want was some story which ended on a Thursday, and by Saturday nobody was interested in it. So it had to be a story which had legs, and which was in the news and would continue to be in the news. It needed to be a story where there was disagreement. It was interesting to listen to John Gummer describe the way in which the parliamentary system was adversarial. And that's the way that much of the media has been presented. And the Moral Maze was really premised on that notion that there should be disagreement and that there should be debate and it should be robust. There was one famous occasion when David Starkey, the gay historian, used a 4-letter word live on radio, and that we thought would mean that the heavens fell, but actually the producer and the BBC were absolutely delighted that he crossed the line, because this showed how robust the debate actually was. There was always extensive disagreement, not just in terms of disagreement, but the areas covered. There would be political disagreement, there would be moral disagreement, and often there would be cultural disagreement. I remember debating with Robert Winston, now Lord Winston of course, on the ethics of the beginning of life. He worked in fertility, and quoting to him from various psalms, because he's an Orthodox Jew, and hearing his interpretation of these particular psalms over and against the classic Jewish, or of course Christian other interpretations. What's interesting in broadcasting is that clarity is everything. The audience is the most important thing in broadcasting. And as when you are invited to write a book, you say, who's the book for? What's the audience going to be like? Likewise, when you're invited to speak. But in radio, you need to think of the audience. And that means clarity. The first producer I ever had for Thought for the Day, where you have 3 minutes in the middle of a busy news program to pick up some item from the news and give some perspective on it. As a Christian, from a Christian perspective, but of course they have people from all religions, and indeed now from no religion at all. They said to me, try to think of one person that you're speaking to. And I was speaking one day about unemployment. The unemployment figures had just come out. So I spoke about unemployment and what it meant for an individual to lose his or her job and how that would affect them. And I thought of a colleague of mine in Oxford, and I really spoke to Clive. I met him about a week later, and he said, oh, I heard you on the radio the other morning. It was just as if you were speaking to me. Yes, well, something like that. You need to get clarity, and in science and faith and in dealing with moral mazes, we need that kind of clarity. But we used experts. It was interesting the way in which the program was premised. You would have 4 witnesses. 2 of them would be high-level expert witnesses, and 2 of them would be more popular kinds of witnesses. So you'd have one on either side, one expert and an expert on the other side, and then the more popular witnesses. But they were not there simply to deliver from the mountaintop the pills that you had to take. Rather, they were there in order to be interrogated. And before the program, we would spend an hour or 2 hours sitting around a table saying, who will take whom? Which witness will you be given? And what opportunity will you have to interrogate the witness? And of course, Michael Burke would always ask the first question. He was the presenter. And then, your witness. And now you knew 2 or 3 questions that you could ask the witness without interruption from the panel. After the first 2 or 3 questions, all hell would break loose. But at least you had that moment. But the witnesses always were there to be interrogated. Nothing they said was taken just because they said it. Nothing was beyond question. Many of you will know the name Richard Peto. He's a well-known epidemiologist. And he was, like Richard Doll, who was his sponsor, very anti-smoking. And we did a program about smoking. And Richard was too busy to come down from Oxford to London, so he was on the line. That means you're sitting in a little box in Oxford, talking as if you're part of the program. And so we got Richard going, and Richard began to speak, and statistic after statistic, and Michael Burke is shaking his head and kept trying to interrupt. And I tried to interrupt, and there was no stopping Richard. So suddenly, Michael Burke pulled the plug. He said, oh, we've just lost the line from Oxford. And I think Richard is probably still in the box in Oxford, still speaking. But he was not to be beyond interrogation. And of course, part of that being a witness was to present evidence. It was to develop an argument. The idea of the model maze was that hopefully people would listen and then carry on the debate. They'd carry on the debate around the dinner table, they'd carry on the debate in the workplace. It was meant to stimulate. It was not meant to close down, but it meant to stimulate. It was then the problem about the end of the program. And you have to recognize that in broadcasting, as I'm sure as we'll hear later on, you have to run to time. And that's particularly important in a live program. And in a live program, often you need somebody at the end just to sum up. And because I'm relatively swift on my feet, they used to often turn to me for a last word. So you have 20 seconds. And of course you think, what can you say in 20 seconds? Well, it's amazing how much you can say in 20 seconds. And the key, always in a debate program, whoever gets the last word is the thing that people remember. So you're all trying to be last. and you're always trying to make sure that you spin it out so there's only 3 or 4 seconds left, and they can't then call on anybody else to say anything. What kind of conclusion should there be? Do you close down debate, or do you open up debate, how to proceed? Well, over the years, working with a relatively same panel, you learn different strategies, and my main opponent was, as I say, David Starkey. David Starkey was brought up in the Quakers. His parents, particularly his mother, was a very devout Quaker. And then when he informed them of his homosexuality, the family really broke off with him, and that was very, very difficult. And David was outrageous, he still is outrageous, but a very flamboyant kind of character. He was a libertarian and entirely secular. He used to make nice kinds of comments in the programme. I hate every Christian, even the nice one sitting beside me. It's the kind of general line that he had. And so he would be propounding a very secular kind of view. And the temptation then was, do you disagree? Do you try to pick it apart? And sometimes I would try to do that. But as time went on, I decided that let David's view stand, but let's offer an alternative view instead. Let's say, yes, you can live in David Starkey's world, and this is what it would mean. Or you can live in my kind of world, and this is what it would look like. Which world do you want to choose? It was developing a strategy whereby the audience, the listeners, would be able to choose for themselves. But to choose, they had to recognize that there was a contrast. That's the moral maze, and the title I was given, Science, Faith, and the Moral Maze. I want now to reflect for a few moments on science. As Rodney said in his kind introduction, I've been working with 29 scientists developing their own view of how their religion, in this case Christianity, actually influences and affects the practice of science. How is science practiced? How is it presented? How is it perceived in our culture? Well, as we began to do the book and edit the book and work with the individuals and sometimes the pairs who were writing, it became clear that physics was an area where there was a problem. A problem about how do we view the beginning of the universe. Do we have a very simplistic, literal Genesis view? John Gummer made reference to Genesis and was very clear to say the kind of myth. Do we regard it as a myth? And what kind of picture is then? Often theologians are very cavalier with language. When they talk about myth, they don't mean a made-up story. They mean simply a way of presenting, a way of picturing. But often when we hear the word myth, we think, oh, it's another fairy story. Physics offers us different accounts of the beginning of the universe, and there's disagreement. But I think that the shift in science is really away from physics and chemistry, though I do have a number of geneticists who tell me that biochemistry is the thing of the future, and it's going to be back to biochemistry. But I think it's biology which is the key kind of area of concern. And in terms of biology, we're looking really at the beginning of life. How did life emerge? What is the nature of human life? And of course, in geology, there are problems too. How did the world begin? How do we date the world? How do we understand the geology of the world? At breakfast, again, I was struck, as Dennis Alexander said last evening, with the variety. There we were sitting with a South African, a Ghanaian, and someone from Greece. And so there was an international kind of flavour. The young lady from Greece is a social psychologist, interested in the whole area of communication. And of course, psychology is a huge growth area. When I was a student in Edinburgh, I say to people in Oxford, I went to a real university, Edinburgh. But in Edinburgh, you have to choose if you want to study philosophy. And the subject is called mental philosophy. The unkind say that's because you have to be mental to do it, but that's just unkind. And that is to distinguish it from natural philosophy, which is physics. So there are only two kinds of philosophies, natural philosophy or mental philosophy. But in the tradition of Hume, who of course was part of Edinburgh, though not part of the university, psychology was a necessary part of doing philosophy. You could not do philosophy properly unless you did psychology. It was a requirement to have a degree in philosophy. But once you began to do psychology, you discovered there were many, many different schools of psychology. And there were differences between the highly statistical social scientists whose view of science and psychology in particular was very much a statistical kind of view, over and against the Freudians or the Jungians and all the different schools, particularly of psychoanalytic tradition. Now, what's the nature of human beings? Psychology offers us alternatives and, of course, creates problems. Then last evening we had a very robust presentation about the acceptance of global warming. I don't want to enter into a debate about that, though I do have to say that much of my time is spent in the US, and there the debate is long and hard over whether or not there is such a thing as global warming and how serious global warming actually is. I was part of a seminar the other week and someone was presenting saying that actually the atmosphere is regaining, the ozone layer is closing up. Global warming is not going to be the problem we thought it was going to be, and so on and so on. And so it's clear that in the minds of the public, science produces problems. Problems in physics, the beginning of the universe; biology, beginning of life; geology, beginning of the world; psychology, the nature of human beings; and of course in the environmental sciences, global warming and all the attendant kinds of issues. In the seminaries, science is also seen as creating problems. How are we to talk about creation? How are we to talk about the beginning of the world? Do we, as tends to be the scene in most of the scientific world, take evolution as a given? Or do we want to say, no, it's actually about intelligent design? In conversation again, we're hearing about how in Southampton they had a debate between creationists, those who believe in a literal 7-day creation, over and against those who uphold the view of intelligent design. What would have been interesting was to have had an evolutionist. I love the story of the evolutionist who's walking through the forest and he sees this tree and he says, "Isn't evolution marvelous?" And then he walks a little bit further and he sees a fox running past and he says, "Oh, isn't evolution marvelous?" And then suddenly he hears a noise and he turns around and here is a huge 6-foot grizzly bear. And the evolutionist takes to his heels and begins to run. And he's running away and the grizzly bear is running after him. And he keeps looking over his shoulder, doesn't watch where he's going, and the evolutionist trips over a set of roots, falls. And the grizzly bear is standing over, just about to pounce. And the evolutionist in panic says, "God, save me!" At which point time freezes. And this voice from heaven says, "Do you really think it's fair that after all these years of rejecting me and believing in nothing but evolution, that I should save you?" And the evolutionist said, "Well, not really, but you could convert the bear." Smash! Everything turns back into real time. And the bear puts its paws together and says, "Lord, for what we are about to receive, I'm so thankful." There's a debate about creation, evolution, or intelligent design. There's also, I think, in the scientific world, and I think this is becoming more and more obvious to the general public, there's a gap between theory and practice. There's a gap between, if you like, the philosophers of science and the bench scientists. There's a gap between those who appear in the media as talking heads over and against the actual practice. Just again, picking up Robert Wilson, it's been interesting since he moved out of most of the practice, and that's not totally, but most of the practice, and became really a professional politician and media person. The way in which his style and expressions have modified now much more into the professional talking head rather than presenting the view of the bench scientist. If you look at Robert's statements when he was working in fertility, he was much less measured You may not think he's very measured now, but he's much less measured. He was much less measured then than he is now. Science was there really to interrogate reality. I like the picture from Francis Bacon that what the scientist does is that he or she tortures nature. It's a very aggressive kind of picture that nature is made to serve humanity. Nature is made to reveal its secrets. And so you torture. President Bush would approve of Francis Bacon's metaphor, I'm sure. But science, of course, presents evidence. Now what's interesting, of course, is what counts as evidence. What actually counts as being evidence and relevant. Science presents hypotheses. Here's a claim, and not just a claim, but a claim which carries certain kind of significance. There's some significance attached to the claim made, and therefore the claim must be supported. It's interesting that in philosophical terms, at the turn of the century, verification was the name of the game. What the logical positivists wanted, the atomists, they were great supporters of science, and they thought science is the key. Science will give us the key to unlock the mysteries of the universe, and what it offers us is absolute verification. And they even produced a principle called the verification principle, that a statement is true if and only if it can be verified by sense experience. Everything was to be tested, and if it was verified and verifiable, you accepted it. If it wasn't, it was rubbish. And so morality, religion, aesthetics were all dismissed by the verification principle. But then people asked, well, can you verify the verification principle? And they discovered that you couldn't verify the verification principle. And so they lost confidence in the verification principle. Someone was looking at my book and saying, it's still in print, it's the 12th impression. Well, one of the interesting things is where impressions change. And E.G. Ayre, in his first edition of Language, Truth and Logic, gives the hard form of the verification principle. By the 5th impression, he has a much softer, gentler version, because it came under such criticism. And ultimately, it came under such criticism that Karl Popper came along with his falsification principle. In the end, what science does is it seeks to establish by trying to falsify. And if I cannot falsify, I accept it as true in the meantime. In the meantime, it's more probability than absolute certainty. It's not hard and fast, it's provisional. And therefore, revisionism is the name of the game. That gives a different feel not just to what counts as evidence, but what significance evidence has for the community, for the society, whether it's the society of scientists or whether it's the general society. What kind of conclusions do we come to then? Are acceptance or rejection absolute, or is it provisional? One of the key books which really underscored the significance of this was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. When I'm trying to illustrate it to my students, I say, imagine you're walking through ancient Egypt and you see that well-known scientist Ptolemy, and you say, hello Ptolemy, what are you doing today? Well, I'm doing a very important experiment. And you're very excited. Please, could I be part of this experiment? He says, right. What you need to do is you want to stand absolutely still. I want you to stand on this spot, and I want you to watch that big yellow object in the sky. And I want you to observe everything that that object does. And I'll be back in 12 hours. So Ptolemy comes back 12 hours later and says, did you move? No. Did you stay here all the time? Yes. Did you observe that yellow object in the sky? Yes. What happened? Well, it moved across the sky. That's wonderful. So now we have a scientific truth. Scientific truth that the sun revolves because you didn't move and the earth didn't move. Therefore, we have the geocentric view of the universe, and everybody believed it. Everybody believed it, of course, until Copernicus came along. Copernicus and Galileo, they looked through the telescope, and they saw the movement of the planets suggested that perhaps it was not possible for the Earth to be the center of the universe. These combinations of planets could perhaps only occur if indeed the sun was the center of the universe. So the heliocentric view of the universe was developed, and everybody believed it. Everybody believed it, of course, until along came Einstein with his theory of relativity. I always think Reading Station is the best place to explain the theory of relativity. You're sitting in a train in Reading Station and you look out the window and think, oh, we're off. And then you look out the other window and say, oh, no, we're not. We're still sitting in Reading Station, which is a nightmare in itself. It's the other train which is moving. Movement is relative. And so motion being relative means there is no absolute motion. And everybody accepts that. Now it's interesting the way in which the culture begins to accept the scientific view of the world, whatever that view is. But Kuhn made the point that scientific revolutions change, actually bring about different perspectives, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding the world. And therefore we have to hold to our view of the world as provisional, not absolute. It's something which is ultimately pragmatic. It works. Occam's razor was developed as a way of judging between competing theories. If you had two theories which were totally consistent, corresponded with a certain kind of reality, how did you judge between them if there was no overwhelming evidence for the one or the other? And the test, really, for Occam is pragmatic. Does it really work? Does it really transform? Or is it just a fad which will actually wither away and die? Science, as it's practiced, presented and perceived, ultimately has to be pragmatic. It has to make a difference. It has to change. It has to transform. What about our understanding of science and faith? Well, of course, we all have some kind of faith. But what they're interested in, and what Faraday Institute is interested in, is exploring that relationship between faith and science. And of course, scientists have many aspects of faith. A credo, I believe. They believe in induction. One of the problems in teaching philosophy is that it's often very obscure. So what you do is you develop little stories and illustrations. And Bertrand Russell developed a wonderful story to show you the nature of induction. The difficulty is everybody remembers the story, but they never actually remember the point in the story. And so sometimes you can tell a story which is so good that people remember it, we can't remember what the point is. In explaining induction and the limits of induction, he uses an example of chickens. I've adapted it for theological purposes. I began teaching in an Anglican theological college, which for a Baptist like me was a depressing experience. But teaching in an Anglican seminary, our principal was a man called Michael Green. Now, Michael Green was a larger-than-life, and still is, larger-than-life character. And Michael kept chickens. And so every morning at 9 o'clock, Michael would go down and he would feed the chickens. 365 days in the year, Michael would go down 9 o'clock, feed the chickens. So it's day 366, it's 5 minutes to 9 in the chicken coop. And one of the chickens says to the other chickens, in 5 minutes the door will open and Michael Green will come in and he will feed us. 9 o'clock strikes, the door opens, Michael Green comes in and he wrings the chicken's neck. Now, this is the fatal objection to the principle of induction, because in the end, even though you have 365 positive examples, it just takes one counter-example to undermine the absolute nature of the principle. So it really Russell's adapted story. Scientists do believe in induction, they believe in evolution. I think sometimes the truism from Wilde that America and Europe and the United Kingdom are two countries divided by a common language. And that division runs over, of course, in the sciences. The whole question of evolution is really a non-issue in much of the practice of Christians in the sciences here in the UK. But it's a hot topic in the practice of science in the United States. And indeed, school boards are deciding whether or not they should or should not be teaching evolution in schools, whether or not it's only a theory and cannot be proven, and that creationism ought to be taught equally alongside. Scientists, however, generally do believe in evolution. They believe, as T.F. Torrance used to say, in the inherent intelligibility of the world. The world makes sense, and that's what makes science possible. that we are able to explore the world because it makes sense. I say to my students, TUC, what does that stand for? And Trades Union Congress. Or BOLTOP, Boltop, what does that stand for? And of course, those of you who are aficionados of the 14th of February will know it says better on lips than on paper. And then I write up TTYB, what does that mean? And they offer me all kinds of thanks, all kinds of ideas, and eventually they say, we don't know, what does it mean? I said, well, it doesn't mean anything, I just made it up. But what happens is that people assume that it makes sense, but also they have the inherent intelligence to try to make sense of a world which makes sense. Science is only possible when things make sense and when we have the capacity, the ability to make sense of that. And that's why I think within the Roman Catholic tradition, the understanding of natural law is really very important. With Protestant audiences, if you say natural law, people recoil. If you say creation patterns, they all nod sagely and think it's wonderful. But actually the difference between creation patterns and natural law is really very slight. Cause and effect is very much, in spite of David Hume's attempt to disprove cause and effect, the way that science operates and the way that human beings operate is that we assume a link, a causal sequence, a link between cause and effect. We believe in the scientific method. We believe in statistics. A young man from Southampton was describing how he'd been in Parliament showing MPs the fruit of his work, and many young scientists were. And he said, you know, it was interesting to see politicians come over to your particular poster, saying, well, that's very interesting, explain it to me. And then their eyes would glaze over until they found the epidemiologists. And when they found the epidemiologists, then their faces would come alive, because here were statistics that they could make policies with. And this really was the point in science, rather than all the really interesting things. Statistics is very much the language which confirms, which supports, which helps people. It was interesting listening to references to spin doctrine. And of course, spinning, whether it's in the political world or in any other kind of world, really offers ways that the public can accept this is really true, this is really important. When I was reading free newspapers, as a Scotsman, I never buy a newspaper. I wait for somebody else to buy it and leave it, and then I can pick it up. So I picked up in Chicago Airport a free newspaper that somebody had bought and left, and it was interesting to see that President Bush's ratings had gone back up again. And there was great concern among the Republicans that perhaps they would all lose in the November elections because of being tied to Bush and the war in Iraq. And his rating had gone down to 31%. But now it's gone up to 44%, and 53% of the Americans believe that the war in Iraq is a justified war. Now these are statistics. 53% of what? 44% of what? 31% of what? And of course it's of a focus group, it's of a selection. It's not of the whole American population. But we believe it. And even more, President Bush believes it, and the Republicans and the Democrats believe it, because statistics is evidence, it's hard fact. Well, is it or isn't it? I think science is believed because it works. If scientists didn't actually produce the goods, if we didn't see the effects of the strategies of scientists, of the fruits of science, most of my work is done in the hospital setting, working with professional doctors, nurses, medical scientists. And when we're looking, for example, at research projects, we're asking not only is there a proper research project here, but will it actually make a difference? Will it work? Will it really affect patients? Otherwise, why are we doing this medical experiment? Why are we doing this clinical trial unless there is an outcome which will actually change, transform, help patients? It has to work. But science also, I think, rests on a belief about truth and honesty. I have a colleague, David Klein, an Old Testament scholar. and he was visiting the United States. And the trouble with being a visiting scholar is you run out of lectures to give. And so what do you do then? Well, what David did was he decided to go to the library on this university campus. So he went along to the library and he looked at the journals. He never has a chance to read all the journals, so he's looking, and he saw a journal he'd never seen before. And he thought, oh, this looks interesting, so he picked it up, looked through the table of contents, and he thought, oh, there's an article about something I know about. I'll be interested to read this article. So he began to read it. And after a little while he said, this is familiar. And he read a little bit more, and he said, this is very familiar. And he read a little bit more, and he said, this is my article. And here it was such and such a person, so-and-so State University. And he was not, as they would say, a happy bunny. So David phoned up this man from the State University and said, you've taken my article and published it in this journal. And the man said, that's right, and you should be flattered. I was coming up for tenure, and I was one published piece short. And so I thought, where can I find an obscure article that nobody will have read, which is really quite good? And I found your article, and you know, it was so good that I didn't even have to change a word. I just produced it as it was. Now, this rather undermines the whole academic, scientific endeavour if we cannot rely on the truth and the honesty of the results and the repeatability of the results. Truth and honesty are assumed. We see that in the stem cell situation in Korea, where, as we know, one of the leading specialists there actually falsified the results. And of course that's caused enormous harm to all the stem cell work, and particularly the funding and public confidence in stem cell work. There needs to be a respect for the nature of the object. When we're studying science, we have to recognize that different levels, different approaches are appropriate according to the particular object under study. So if I'm using a telescope to look at microscopic qualities, it's going to be inappropriate. I'm going to have a skewed view. We need to respect the nature of the object. But as scientists have faith, so Christians and those who are practicing of other religions actually have faith as well. Faith that the world was created. That if the world was created, we have a creator. One of the nice things about being invited to speak at conferences, particularly the weekend, if you're coming from the States, is you have to travel and miss classes. So I'm missing a class on the teleological argument, which was to try to prove that there is purpose in the universe. And of course, if you take Aquinas' version, then it's clear that the first cause, the first mover, the designer, is of course what all men, and presumably women now, call God. The notion of creation implies the notion of a creator. And so the world is not self-explanatory. Even when you've described every feature of the physical material world, that will not explain all there is to know about it. But the world is a dynamic context. It's dynamic because it's developing. And so science has to be dynamic to match up with that. And I think that scientists recognize that what is today's perceived wisdom will be outdated very quickly. My wife is in the whole world of education. And in education, if you really want to be depressed, then you read textbooks from 20 years ago and see how out of date those textbooks come. And of course, not just in terms of the hard sciences, but also even the approach in history, geography, all those kinds of realms, the way in which the textbooks now emphasize different kinds of features. Science is dynamic. But religious people recognize that the world in which we live is less than perfect, and we are less than perfect. There was that picture last evening from Genesis, a picture of how, as human beings, we have to guard against our major problem, which is cheating. Why would a stem cell researcher, world-renowned, no problem about finding funding, why would he seek to falsify his results? Why would he pressurize some of his female colleagues into donating their eggs? I mean, it seems at one level such a nonsense, and yet it happened. because we are fallen human beings, less than perfect, living in a less than perfect world. So, what do we say then in relation to this topic of science, faith, and the moral maze? Well, actually, I think it's moral mazes. I want to suggest 3 areas that it would be fruitful for us to think about the intersection between science and faith. The first is nature and theories of truth. What's our understanding of what it means to be true? What is the nature of truth? And of course, there are different theories of truth. There are many different theories, but I've chosen just 3 to illustrate the questions of truth that philosophers and philosophers of science are particularly concerned with. The correspondence theory of truth. I come from the centre of the universe. It's a place called Hawick in the Borders in Scotland. It's so much the centre of the universe that people in Hawick say if you've a day out of Hawick is a day wasted. So I've wasted, sadly, many, many days being elsewhere. Now, Hawick is famous, first of all, for ladies' knitwear, but also because it had the best rugby commentator in the world, a man called Bill McLaren, who still lives in Hawick. Now, the nice thing about Bill McLaren, and if you're not a rugby fan, it doesn't really matter, because when Bill McLaren was commentating on a rugby game, you could close your eyes and you could have a perfect picture of what was happening. His description, his words, corresponded with reality. That's where the correspondence theory of truth is the picture we give, whether it's a mathematical formula, whether it's a scientific account, whether it's some kind of commentary, then it should match up, it should correspond to reality. So that when you hear the picture, it gives an accurate picture of reality. Just to be fair, I should tell you the difficulty about what's called the picture theory of truth or the correspondence theory of truth. And that is, you cannot picture in a picture how a picture pictures what is pictured. If you think about that, you'll find that it's true. You cannot picture in a picture how a picture pictures what is pictured. You need something else. If I say, here is a picture of my wife, and I show you a picture of Claudia Schiffer, you might think, is this true? Well, it's only true if this actually is a picture of my wife. But if you've never seen my wife, you've never seen the particular model in question, you would not know whether this picture was indeed a picture of my wife or not. So you need something more than just the picture and what is pictured. You need some relationship. Correspondence theory of truth. Do our accounts of nature, our accounts of global warming, our accounts of stem cell, of DNA, whatever the level is, do they correspond with reality? Correspondence theory of truth was a reaction against a very widespread idealist view of truth. And idealists, particularly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, people like Bradley and Bosanquet were very strongly of the view that truth was coherent. That for something to be accepted, it had to fit in. And that's the difficulty, of course, in terms of science. I'm thinking about prescription drugs. Voltaire used to say we put drugs of which we know little into bodies of which we know less to cure diseases of which we know nothing at all. And often doctors prescribe drugs which they know do nothing at all. They hope there'll be a placebo effect, but they actually know that the drug doesn't really make any difference. But very few patients think it's a good doctor if you go along and the doctor says you've got a touch of, I love that diagnosis, what's going around at the moment. I'm going to touch of that. And I hope you get better soon. No, we want the doctor to give us something. Indeed, the opening line for many patients is, doctor, please give me something for whatever my particular ailment happens to be. We expect a prescription. What do we do in situations where the drug is not effective? Well, we could give nothing at all, or we could say, let's try and offer something. We give drugs which fit in with the coherence. This is the kind of accepted route. Most medical treatments are those which the profession accepts. And of course, therefore, it's hard when the renegade or the creative person comes along with a new kind of technique, because it has to become the order of the day. It has to cohere with the rest of knowledge, with the rest of truth. So truth actually has to make sense, has to fit in with all the other things that we know. And if it doesn't fit in, then it's very hard to hold it as true. But I think also truth is pragmatic. Truth is pragmatic in the sense that it works, and it enables people to change, it enables situations to change, it enables transformation. Even if there is a debate about global warming, in the end, actually, it will or will not happen. It will or will not make a difference. It will or will not be stopped, changed, and pragmatically there will be evidence, there will be proof. Sadly, it may be too late for us by the time the proof actually comes. And that's where prediction is important. But truth has to be pragmatic, it has to make a difference, it has to change, it has to transform. And that's true in religion as well as in science. But I think that in terms of science and faith, we're not only concerned about the nature of truth, we're concerned about the application of truth. Is nuclear energy really the solution? Well, again, last evening there were various arguments, largely economic, suggesting that it might not be quite the panacea to our energy needs in the world. And certainly I hesitate to think of people driving down the M1 with nuclear-driven cars. That would be a little bit frightening if there was an accident. So nuclear energy isn't going to solve all the energy problems. And of course, when nuclear power was discovered and harnessed, it also created positives and negatives. It meant, yes, there might be cheap, relatively safe power, but it also, of course, created the capacity for nuclear weapons. It's an interesting ethical question to ask to what extent scientists are morally responsible, not just for the scientific truths that they uncover, but for the application and the use of the truths. If you read the history of the splitting of the atom and the scientists who work there, and find the struggles that some of those people were going through, moral struggles, what is appropriate here? Once we realize the risks and the dangers that come from not only making public this knowledge, but when it falls into hands that might not be reliable, trustworthy. To what extent are we morally responsible for the application of truth? And then, of course, ultimately then depends on our values. What values do we have? There are fashions in moral philosophy. The moral philosophy used to talk about morality, and now people don't like the word morality. It smacks too much of the Victorians and prescriptive outlooks. So instead we talk about values. If you want the government to fund something in schools looking at morality, do not talk about morality, but talk about values, and then you'll find the government is very interested in helping fund that. But when it comes to values in science, when it comes to values in religion, when it comes to values for society, we have to ask, what are our source of values? And that's something that I'm hoping to hear your responses to over the weekend, because I think that in a culture where there is division, in a world where there is division, the question of what kind of values. John Gummer was, in a sense, pleading for one particular kind of universal democratic set of values in light of the Armageddon-like threat of global warming. Is that a realistic account of values and of the source of values? Where do we get our values from? You have to be careful about asking and answering that question. A little boy said to his parents, "Mum and Daddy, where do I come from?" And the parents thought, aha, this is my opportunity to give my 7-year-old the sex education lesson. And so they described in fairly graphic detail the human reproductive system. And they said to the little boy, any questions? The little boy said, no, my friend comes from Newcastle, so I wondered where I came from. So you have to be careful in asking and answering the question of values. What's the source of values? And particularly in a multicultural, a multi-religious, a secularized world where there is extreme moral disagreement, what's the source of values to be for our community, for our world? How are we to exercise social control? Values are not platonic ideals existing in a world that make no difference. Values affect politics, they affect the press, the media, they affect the practice, whether it's of science or of religion. They affect the way that society actually operates. And society exercises social control. It exercises the agenda. What we've certainly seen, I think, in the last 30, 40 years in funding for research is a movement away from governmental funding to much more independent groups. It's no accident that Richard Branson is going to give his profits, or his company's profits, or his transport company's profits. That may be an oxymoron, of course, but here he's giving this. It's no accident that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are giving huge amounts of money. And as practicing scientists, many of you will know that you spend your life writing grants rather than actually doing the work. The search for funding is enormous and very difficult. But society exercises control over what kind of areas will be funded. Think of HIV and AIDS. Think about the way in which certain levels of research, certain kinds of research are funded, and the ways in which others are ignored and are not funded. Society offers particular perspectives which make some kind of research very acceptable and other kinds of research very unacceptable. In the United States, you'll know that stem cell research is not funded by government. Now, of course, people then think there's no stem cell research going on in the United States, which of course is not at all true. It's funded by local government, or it's funded by drug companies, or by those who are willing to put money into. And people like Christopher Reeves, when he was alive, Michael J. Fox and others, have raised enormous amounts of money, because society controls the funding. And so the values that a society has are expressed in practice. It's not a theoretical exercise, it's not an idealistic exercise, it's a very practical exercise. And unless we're aware of the values, and unless we're aware of the prioritization of the values, then funding is going to be harder and harder. But funding is driven by social control, by values. Last evening we were presented in a very lively, insightful way the problem of disagreement, the way in which the UK has a parliamentary system which is premised on disagreement. The Model Maze programme and much of broadcasting is premised on disagreement. I remember taking part in a programme with Shad Vara, the founder of the Samaritans. And the Samaritans has been a marvellous organisation. And I was so excited to be on the same programme as Shad Vara. And I went down to London to do the recordings, pre-recorded programme. And this was about pornography. It was whether or not pornography should be more freely available. And I thought Shad Vara and I would agree that pornography was not a good thing and it did damage to people. But he was a libertarian. And he thought that pornography should not be limited and we shouldn't have any kind of social control. And he and I disagreed. And we disagreed fairly strongly and very vocally. Now, you always know a programme is in trouble when, if it's a 28-minute programme, they record for an hour and a quarter. That means there's too much material and they're going to have to cut furiously. So this programme went on for an hour and a quarter, and at the end, Shad Vara was screaming at me. And I felt that I'd provoked him. And how can you provoke somebody who is so involved in the Samaritans and all the rest of it? So afterwards I apologised to the producer. I said, I'm really sorry, it got out of hand. He said, oh, it's all right, it's marvellous, absolutely wonderful, it'll make great radio. And you realise that perhaps the value that he and his team were looking for was rather different from light. It was perhaps more a question of heat. Now, there was disagreement presented, but there was no resolution of the disagreement. And often the problem in our programme, The Model Maze, is that we present disagreement, we present variety, but there's no resolution of that variety. And you can afford to do that in broadcasting. You can afford to do that in newspapers. You can afford to do that in academic discussions. But in life, we have to learn to live and to resolve, in some sort of way, disagreement. And so my hope is that you will help me as a professional ethicist. I told you I never buy newspapers. I once bought the Radio Times. The only reason I bought it was, of course, because my name was going to be in it. And I was so excited about this. It was the first time I was my name in the Radio Times, so I bought it and turned it up, and here was Radio 1 programme mailbag presenter Annie Nightingale, guest Dr. David Cook, brackets, professional Christian, close brackets. I thought about it and thought, well, perhaps it's better to be a professional Christian than an amateur Christian, but I wasn't absolutely sure. As a professional ethicist, you live in a little ivory tower. The ivory tower you have to leave. I leave for the world of the hospital, where real people, hurting people, are often faced with disagreement. Disagreement between families, disagreement between healthcare professionals, sometimes disagreement between the healthcare professionals and the patient and his or her family. How do we resolve disagreement? I can't say, give me a week and I'll think about it. They're looking for a solution immediately. And I want to encourage us to look for solutions to science and faith disagreements. Thank you.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed. That's been immensely stimulating. I'm sure we've got plenty of questions. Would someone like to kick off with a question? Yes.
I was interested if you could say something about the nature of evidence in religious argument.
It's interesting that if you look at the Bible, for example, from a Christian perspective, that the psalmist thinks that nature and the heavens actually offer evidence. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. The Old Testament writers think that history offers evidence, that actually the history of the Jewish people is itself some kind of evidence. The disciples and the writers of not just the Gospels, but of many of the epistles, offer evidence in terms of their experience, what they've seen, what they've heard, and they offer it not just as my personal opinion, they offer it in relation to a community where there were many others present. When after the resurrection, when they're trying to describe the appearances of Jesus, they talk about how up to 500 people at one time saw him, so they offer evidence. Now, of course, that's a very direct way of offering evidence. There are also indirect ways of offering evidence. If you think again of the resurrection appearances, when Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection, when they're out fishing in the Sea of Galilee, and he's preparing a breakfast for them, and they come in, and we're told how they eat fish and bread. Now the implication is that Jesus was a real Jesus. Jesus had a real body. Jesus actually was able to eat and digest. And so that in itself is a kind of evidence as well. I think that when we think about faith, we have to recognize that faith means that you will never have 100% evidence. I often think in terms of religion that if it was 100% evident that Christianity or Islam or Judaism, whatever faith, was absolutely true, then it would be irrational not to believe. People would be totally insane not to believe. But the nature of belief means you cannot have that kind of absolute certainty. You cannot have that kind of absolute proof. As I say, I'm teaching this term or semester, as they call it in the States, philosophy of religion. And part of that is looking at the proofs of God. And there are all kinds of range of proofs, from the ontological, cosmological kinds of arguments. And you present them and you look at these proofs and say, does it work? And of course the students all want it to work. They want to have an absolute proof that they can take out and grab hold of the latest heathen and convince him or her, here's the proof and you must believe. Well, if it's proof, they're not going to believe, they're going to know, and they're going to know beyond any question. The nature of faith is that you cannot know beyond any question. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And so evidence, I think, in that sense, is always going to be provisional. Evidence is never going to be absolute. And I think that that's true in the scientific realm, in the sense that it's it's the best we have at the present time. In the medical sciences, that seems to be so much the case. In looking at the kinds of treatments that people have and give. I had heart surgery in the United States, and the surgeon did a particular bypass technique on me. And I went 3 months later to see my cardiologist. He said, "Oh, if only you'd been 3 months later. We have this wonderful new technique, which doesn't involve breaking your chest bone, tearing your chest apart, and working hard. It's all done through a little micro-cut." And I was not really cursing the thought of 3 months of living as I've been living. But, you know, what was the accepted way? Absolutely all the surgeons, all the top people worked in a particular way. And then within 3 months, suddenly it's passé, it's not the best way to go. Here is a new kind of technique. And everybody believes that. The evidence is not, I think, quite as we would like it to be. Absolute, what the Americans call slam dunk. You cannot question it, it's there, and it's never beyond question. The good scientist, the good religious person, is constantly re-examining.
But there are claims that it's falsified. The Paparians would say that it's been falsified.
But is it falsified in an absolute way? I think that's the question. The falsification, if acceptance is provisional, so is rejection.
Yeah.
And I think that it cuts both ways.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question about scientific evidence. As scientists, we go on about science. But I was challenged by somebody who was against what I was doing. And they said, well, your latest paper shows that your earlier paper was wrong. And so it raised the question, well, was Newton, Einstein, Hawking, are they all doing sound science? They're all showing that progression. And I think that the problem is that fewer people are doing science now. And so fewer people, if they ever did, actually, I guess it's always been a fairly small section of the population that have understood how science works and evidence works. I guess my question is there a role in society for teaching a large number of the population how science works, how evidence is collected together? You keep, as you said, you challenge it, and until eventually you have some confidence in that. But somebody might still come along and undermine it later. And it's really trying to get people to understand that and not seeing it as, you know, science is the answer to everybody's prayers. You know, that's kind of the other extreme.
This is a very important thing. It seems to me no accident that many universities have developed chairs or specific rules for the public understanding of science, because they recognize the gap between how scientists understand science and how the general public, and that's where the role of broadcasting, the role of the media is really very crucial, but it's also the role of schools, and science often is not very well taught in the school kind of setting. And I think that's a challenge. It's a challenge. How do we help people communicate? It's like in the medical world, you know, I speak from my own kind of experience. How far do you explain to patients the risks? I had a friend who was a very fine specialist in diabetes, and he was having some stomach problems. So he went to visit a colleague, a well-known gastroenterologist. And the gastroenterologist thought, oh, here is a medical colleague. I must explain to him every conceivable risk that would happen to him. And so he began to describe in fairly graphic detail all the things that might be wrong with my friend. And after, you know, a long catalogue, he said, stop, stop, stop. Just make me better. Because that was really what mattered. He wanted to be made better. And so how do you balance the public confidence with proper understanding? But if you do not have proper understanding, then it's misplaced confidence. And I think that's what worries me. The gap between how scientists think they're operating over against how the public imagine science is operating, and what kind of levels of certainty are there. But how do you do that without undermining the whole process of science and helping people live with the reality that life isn't always going to be better. many of my students, certainly in the United States, come from very well-off backgrounds. And they imagine that they are going to live more comfortably than their parents lived. And the answer is, no, they're not. We're going to have to settle, and they're going to have to settle, for a lower standard of living. Now, this is not a popular message when you're trying to convey to young people that they are going to have a poorer quality of life than their parents. Because, of course, the natural expectation, I will do better than my parents, my children will do better than I, and so on and so on. So how you balance giving people the bad news that we're going to have to live more simply, that we may have to cut back on what we regard as necessities, which are really luxuries, and at the same time give people the desire to carry on living, the desire to carry on doing science. I think that's very difficult. I'm interested in whether people have wisdom about how to balance a proper understanding of science with a confidence which people need to have in medicine. You need to have confidence in the doctor. But if I go to a breast specialist and say, I've got breast cancer, and he says to me, well, if I were a surgeon, I'd say surgery. If I were a radiotherapist, I'd say radiotherapy. If I were a biochemist, I'd say, chemical reactions. Actually, we don't know. And that would be true. But that's all what patients want to hear at that particular time. So how do you help convey the truth in a way which doesn't remove all confidence and all hope?
Can I just push you on that question of knowledge of the future, if you like, of diagnosis and uncertainty a bit more? Because the case has been put, for instance, that if we could get a test that showed whether you were going to get Alzheimer's, would it be good to tell a person or not?
Right.
So what's the ethics of that?
Yeah, it's very different. I have family members, and the grandmother died from Huntington's chorea. Huntington's chorea is a really nasty disease. It manifests itself round about the age of 30, sometime after 30. You lose control of your body, your mind is sending out a message, your body doesn't control, and they're very jerky movements. Now, she was put in a mental asylum. They thought she was mad, the way she behaved. After she died and did a post-mortem, they discovered she had Huntington's chorea. She had 2 children, both of whom were told that their mother had had Huntington's chorea. Both married. The one who married, the young woman who married, had 2 children. The young man who married decided that he would have no children. And so the one who married with 2 children, she developed Huntington's chorea. They both actually developed Huntington's chorea, both died. And that then left a problem for the son and the daughter, who were the grandchildren of the original. And they were given the choice. Do you want to know whether or not you will have Huntington's chorea? We know there's a genetic link. If you have the gene, you'll have the disease. The young woman said yes, she wanted to know. And she went ahead, had the test, and still went ahead and had 2 children, even though the test was positive. The young man decided not to have the test. Now, the young woman is 32, and every time she drops a glass, she looks in the mirror and she thinks, has my Huntington's chorea started? The young man, who's 20, 28, 29, every time he drops a glass, he looks in the mirror and thinks, maybe I have got Huntington's chorea after all. Now, both of them are living with a kind of uncertainty. That's a different kind of uncertainty, because one knows that she will absolutely develop Huntington's chorea, ceteris paribus, other things being equal. The young man does not know whether he will or will not, but he knows it's possible. Now, whether you psychologically would like to live with that vague possibility or the certainty. And that's why we talk much in medical ethics about the right to know. But I say that people, if they have a right to know, they have a right not to know as well. And whether or not we have to force people and tell people, that's a really important thing. I once got this terribly wrong. I was doing Pause for Thought with Terry Wogan, and I used an example which I thought made the point very well, and I'm sure it did, of a friend of mine who has Huntington's chorea, it's a different person, and how she died. And suddenly the switchboard was flooded with families phoning, complaining about what I'd said and how this had removed all confidence how patients would, worry about this, and how his families, every time he began coughing, they would think this was the end, and so on. So it's very easy to give people accurate, totally accurate, but whether or not it was wise, whether or not it was a good thing, whether or not individuals could cope with it, that depends, sadly, on the individual. So some people would want to know and some people don't know.
Do you have any specific religious perspective on that? Because you didn't mention that. As a Christian?
Yes, as a Christian, I think that we believe that the truth makes people free, but we're also encouraged to speak the truth in love. And I think that how we express truth to people is very important. There's a cartoon in the States which is, does my bum look big in this? And this is, here's this lady who's trying on some new kind of outfit, and the husband is being asked to pass a judgment. Now that's a really nasty moment. Yes is not a good answer. If you say absolutely no, and it's not the case, then you're going to have problems further down the line. So, oh, you look splendid in that outfit, is the kind of, I think speaking the truth in love. I don't think that truth speaking means you have to tell all of the truth all of the time. And that doesn't mean say you tell lies. I think that's the religious perspective.
Thank you. One question.
Yeah, to what extent, coming to the whole sort of area of broadcasting and so on, and particularly thinking about the political process, and if one really wants to, from hearing last night about how the political process works and so forth. Now, in a way, what we heard last night was that a moral position, what is a moral position, should be worked through Parliament in this case, in essentially a kind of rather Machiavellian way, I think was, kind of using the system, to accomplish your goals. To what extent would you personally think that is a good approach for somebody who's in politics, let's say, or to what extent do you think that their own, if they have a religious faith, their religious faith should be more overt and should be more upfront, if you like, in terms of when they're making their moral points? Or do you think they should just play the system whatever way they can and keep their religion in the background? How do you think that's a role of religion in public life in the context of politics?
Thank you. I think that people are holistic, people are whole people. And if you have integrity, and I think we saw an example last evening from a man who did have integrity, who wanted to express his faith in ways that he thought were appropriate and wasn't hesitant so to do. But he was also a politician and had learned how to play the political game. I think that I'm often called to comment on the latest medical discovery or the significance for medicine and medical ethics and so on. Now, I don't begin by saying, well, I'm a spirit-filled Bible believer and here's the answer. I say, here's this new technique, this is what it does, this is the kind of problem with it, these are the kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about. And then, I'd say 95% of the time, the interviewer will say, but what are we to do about it? And I'll say, well, you can do this or you can do that. And then they'll say, but you're a Christian, so what does Christianity have to say about this? Now, I think that that's a better way to earn the right to have my morality taken seriously than if I begin by proclaiming my moral standard without really showing I understand what the issues are. I think that in politics there's room for the Lord Altons of this world, who clearly had a very particular religious perspective and was not afraid or not ashamed to express that very forcefully. I think there are others who do have Christian and other faiths who work at their job well and try to express their faith in that way. I think the key from my perspective is expressing their faith, giving reasons for the hope that's within them, not being ashamed in appropriate settings. But I do think that in politics and in the media, people have to earn the right. I don't think just because you've been interviewed, you have the right to force your morality. But I do think you have a right to show that you grasp what the subject is, and then to offer some perspective. And I found that when it was announced I was going to the States, I got more letters from non-Christian people saying how much they were going to miss me from the moral maze than I had from religious people. Because and what was interesting was the non-religious were saying, you speak for the kinds of values, the kinds of values that we want, and we'll miss having that. And that was very telling to me, that even though they disagreed, I think of a well-known Liberal MP, and he and I disagree on almost everything. And we have debated in radio and television regularly, and debated in Oxford and committees regularly. And he said to me, you know, David, I agree with 95% of everything that you say, except that religious rubbish bit. That's the bit wrong.
Can I follow, just follow that up a bit? Is it becoming more difficult, do you think, to be a Christian in public life? I'm thinking, perhaps especially as a Roman Catholic, actually. I'm thinking of Ruth Kelly being attacked, you know, when she was made a government minister. Someone was prevented from becoming a European commissioner because he was a Roman Catholic very recently. So in public life, not just in politics, but maybe medicine, if you have particular views, maybe you can't be a gynecologist. I don't know. Do you?
Yes. This is a tricky question because even though I'm still in the UK some of the year, I don't have a natural feel so much for what's happening. When I was beginning academic career, if it's call it a career, people said to me, oh, as a religious person, you'll never be accepted. And I found that was not true. It was not true in Oxford. It was not true in the medical school. People said, oh, medical ethics, they won't listen to you because you're religious. And I found that that was not true at all. That people were desperate for help. And as long as you were appropriate, as long as you listened carefully and responded to them, then there were no bars against. Now, I think there is a virulent secularism, which you know, people like David Starkey would gladly say, yes, I'm a virulent secularist. And certainly there is an agenda which is anti-Christian, anti-religious, and there are casualties there. But I'm not sure it's a necessary situation. And I think it is possible, certainly in the academic world, the scientific world, the political world I don't pretend to know as well. But, you know, I spoke with a paediatrician at the London lectures, and the paediatrician was taken to task by some of the medical students because he was too concerned about his patients. He was becoming emotionally involved. And they said, that's not the role of a doctor. He said, no, look, if it was your child, would you rather have a doctor who cared or a doctor who didn't care? And I thought that expressed the point very well. Would you rather have somebody who has some religious moral views or someone who has moral views which are very different from what you as an individual or the population generally have? And I think we need to challenge people in that.
Thank you.
I was going to make a similar sort of comment. I worked for 6 years with the House of Commons Select Committee, so I saw a lot of politicians in a rather informal way in the bar and things like that. And I have a lot of respect for the great majority of the people who are in Parliament, and there are some who are clearly climbing fast and will say the appropriate thing. And Stephen Byers is one of my pet noirs and reptiles in that case. And nobody trusts them. And it's perfectly obvious what they're trying to do. There are many others who are people of integrity, whether they're religious or not. And they are respected, though they're not always successful. And I mean, all of us have to make that choice at some point in our careers, I suppose. And so I think the key thing is what David said. Is there a consistent set of values behind your contribution to this particular debate? And you don't have to force Christianity down their throat, but you can be, I think, I've always found that people, and I'm thinking of others as well as my own experience, more than my own experience, if they have a consistent set of values and speak from that set of values, that's a perfectly proper contribution to the debate. You may win, you may lose. I guess the other thing to say about politicians, and relative to John Gummer last night, politicians are very different from scientists. They're deal makers. And they all the time are looking for deals, and they owe you one from 5 years ago, and you owe them one, and you get together over in the bar and you do a deal. And you walk away with a solution you can both live with. That's very common. Business works the same way. So they learn to live with imperfect solutions. And we who are scientists sometimes find that very difficult to handle. So they're different sorts of creatures. And what I admire about John Gummer is his clear and open Christian faith, and his willingness to do deals, to reach an objective which is bigger than him. Not everybody shares that view, but so you can be. And one of the things we're going to talk about all weekend, I think, Rodney, because I'm going to come back to it tomorrow, is how we resolve disagreements. I mean, that's what's troubling me at the moment. And I don't have an answer tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow morning. But how we resolve disagreements where lots of us have perfectly proper starting points, like Starkey and yourself, David, and yet authority can't rule. Governments can't rule, NGOs can't rule, Parliament, we heard last night, can't rule. So how are we to find solutions that we can all live with? And I'm still don't have an answer to that one. Maybe, David, you do. You're very good at things.
Yeah, Martin at the back. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if what we tend to work towards, at least in this country, are rules, either enshrined in Parliament or whatever. But what you tend to be doing on programmes like the Moral Maze and probably sort of front-end ethics committees and so on, are looking at original cases, individual cases, which are maybe the first cases and the ones that are pioneering perhaps new fruits of biomedical science and that sort of thing. But and religion has always been one for laying down rules or moral codes and so on, but is it actually ever completely fair to have a rule for everyone? Aren't there always going to be exceptions where if you follow the rule, moral injustice will be done?
In the Hospital Ethics Committee in Oxford, because it's a research hospital, then often you're confronted with brand new type questions. And often they would bring the problem to the Hospital Ethics Committee. And I would say to them, whatever you do, whatever we decide is to be done, that sets the standard. And that's going to be the general rule. It's going to be the general rule. So we have to ask, can we all live with this question about, here the hospital will have a general standard. Now rules are very important. They're very important because they mean I do not have to sit down every time and work it out for myself. It means that I'm able to rely. But of course, if you apply the rules legalistically, then it can actually, as you properly say, lead to moral harm. So how we help people understand, here is a way of understanding the issue, here is a way of framing the question, here is a starting point, not necessarily the ending point, but a starting point, so that I can understand what are the options here, what are the general things I need to be concerned about. And that's, I think, the benefit that we have from rule-learned behaviour. The difficulty is it can be taken too far. And so as human beings, how we maintain an openness to some special characteristic without cheating. Because so often the problem is that, oh well, this is my general rule, except it doesn't apply to me, because of course I'm different. And special pleading over and against a genuine morally significant difference. And so when people want to question the rule, I want to know what's the basis of the questioning of the rule. What kind of support, what kind of evidence, what kind of ground is there for not applying the rule? Because even if I were a utilitarian, I mean, the big debate is, I'm going to have a general rule. So here's a general rule which I follow most of the time, other things being equal. But there may be some exceptional circumstance, which means I need to look very hard. And what I do is I don't throw away the rule. What I do is I say the rule applies most times, but in cases like this, then it doesn't apply. Now in cases like this means, again, I've created another rule. So it's still a rule-governed behaviour. The question is whether I hold it in a rule-based way, or whether I hold it in a way where I recognise the value and the worth of the rule, but I recognise also there may be other moral considerations which need to be taken account of.
Just a quick comment, Rodney. We had in the university a notwithstanding rule. So if a hard case came to Senate and all the rules said this person should be dismissed or something, we could say notwithstanding and then proceed to do exactly the opposite from the rule.
But you then have to justify the
Absolutely, absolutely. So you didn't destroy the rule, and it was quite clearly an exception. And it was a very useful, pragmatic way of dealing with problems.
Now we're approaching coffee time. Maybe just one more quick question. Anyone? That's very good point. Thank you, Dennis. We do have a panel this evening of our speakers over the weekend, and I think Becky will have a box in which to put written questions for the panel. Where's that going to be? Okay,
I'll put it on the table.
probably on the table here. So if you have a written question for the panel this evening, then I would encourage you to put it in the box. Maybe one last one. Yes.
Would there be any ethical, let's say, basis, behind that protest against animal, let's say, testing laboratories, everywhere in the world? And what's your opinion from the Christianity point of view?
Yes, this is a very good question about animal experiments, and of course Oxford has been paralysed with protesters. It's been very interesting for me with xenotransplantation, which is taking organs from animals, putting them in human beings. On the authority, we have a member of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and they describe how their funding and their work has been undercut by much of the animal liberation front and their kind of behaviour, because it's seen as a kind of extremism rather than of cold reasoning. And I know that one meeting of our authority, which is a public meeting, we were taken over by protesters who were wearing pig heads, pretending to be animals, and the whole thing just dissolved. The meeting just fell apart. Certainly there are moral questions. Moral questions about how do we treat animals. And if you're asking for a Christian perspective, it's clear that animals were given to be cared for, they were given for food, they were given to be stewarded, and so that's very much the perspective. And people like Andrew Lindsay has written very extensively from a Christian perspective on this. On the other hand, you've got people like Peter Singer writing on the rights of animals, saying actually some animals are more important than some human beings, because some animals are persons, but some human beings are not persons. And so if you are Alzheimer's sufferer, if you are in the womb, if you are mentally retarded, then you're not really a person, and so we should be able to kill you. But if you're a dolphin or a pig, you are a person, and therefore you ought not to be killed, and certainly not eaten. So that there is a debate here, and it's a proper kind of debate. And I think it's been suggested how we live with difference. But I don't think that we live with difference by threatening people who are building an animal house with sending nail bombs to families whose father happens to work in animal experimentation. And certainly, if it's a choice between saving Granny and saving my pet dog, I think Granny wins just. Not least because she's going to... No, not and so I think we do need to have a public debate, but it needs to be a debate where we actually offer reasons. And I think some animal liberation members do not help their cause by the nature of the thing. So much so that as last evening, it was suggested it's not a moral cause, like hunting. So no, I found that very difficult. It seems to me there is a moral case that you can make, and then we need to hear the moral case, we need to respond to it. But I think it's a judgment, it's a moral judgment. And I think religion has much to offer in that debate, but it's a competing set of values, and we need to decide which values, as a society, as a community, as a scientific community, are we going to have. Do we really believe that computer imaging will be enough, or do we actually need to make sure that drugs are tested on animals before they're tested on human beings? And that's a progression.
Thank you. Well, that's a terrific start to our morning today. So thank you very much, David.